Hello Flight Simmers and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. This is lesson 15 in our VFR or Private Pilot Training series. We're nearing the end of our private pilot level training course, and so far in this series we've been talking about normal operations, or how we fly the airplane when everything is working normally. In this video we'll take a look at how you handle situations when things start to malfunction. Of course, everything in Flight Simulator is designed to work correctly unless you don't want it to, so we'll also take a look at how to cause malfunctions and other trouble for yourself in Flight Simulator. There are basically two levels of things going wrong in aviation: abnormal operations and emergency operations. We'll define abnormal operations as any situation or event where it's not possible to continue the flight using normal procedures, but the safety of the aircraft or its occupants is not threatened. It may require timely corrective action from the pilot or use of special or abnormal procedures, and it may have the potential to escalate to an emergency if corrective action is not taken or special or abnormal procedures are not used. We'll define an emergency as any situation or event where the safety of the aircraft or its occupants is threatened. It typically requires immediate corrective action from the pilot or use of emergency procedures to ensure a safe outcome. We'll be focusing today's lesson primarily on abnormal operations. Most of the abnormal events you can have in the 152 are related to instrument or system failures of some kind. These can include individual instrument failures and system failures such as loss of the vacuum or electrical systems. Emergency conditions on the 152 typically involve critical systems failures such as an engine failure or flight control failure or fires of some kind. Whether or not an event is an emergency or abnormal situation depends a lot on the experience level of the pilot. What an inexperienced pilot may perceive as an emergency, a more experienced pilot may deal with as an abnormal situation. In the real world, the pilot in command has the authority to make the decision as to whether an event is an emergency, and they will rarely be questioned if they decide an emergency exists. In the real world, when in doubt, declare an emergency and get assistance in any way that will assure a safe outcome for yourself and your passengers. In the real world, ATC can also declare an emergency for a pilot if they feel the situation warrants it. Again, in Flight Simulator, everything will work correctly unless you choose for it not to work. So how do you cause trouble for yourself in Flight Simulator? There is a failure menu in Flight Simulator that lets you fail things on your aircraft. You can access it from the aircraft picture in the world map. Once you've selected the aircraft picture, it's the fourth selection down from the top. But this menu is limited pretty much exclusively to engine problems, most of which constitute emergency situations. Again, since we'll be talking primarily about abnormal situations in this lesson and emergency situations in the next lesson, we'll go more in depth about this menu in the next video. For PC users, there's a very good third-party mod called Random Failures that has an extensive list of items you can fail and a variety of ways in which the failures can be triggered. I'll talk more about how you can get that mod and how you can use it at the end of this lesson. You can also cause or simulate system failures just by configuring systems in a certain way. For example, we'll cause ourselves an electrical system failure just by turning off the alternator in the 152. So what sort of abnormal situations can we encounter in the 152? Most of the abnormal events you can encounter in the 152 again involve either individual instruments failures or system failures. With the exception of the airspeed indicator, individual instrument failures are pretty straightforward to deal with in the 152 when flying VFR. Just look out the window and use visual cues to fly the airplane. An airspeed indicator failure is a little bit of a different animal and can be disorienting even to experienced pilots in VFR conditions. But since the only way to fail it is the third-party mod, I'll do a separate video for that failure. Instrument systems can fail as well. On the 152, the big instrument system failure is the vacuum system. If it fails, you lose both your attitude indicator and your heading indicator. Again, in VFR, this is not a big deal. You have a perfectly good picture of the horizon out the window and a magnetic compass to give you a general idea of which direction you're facing. That, coupled with looking at landmarks, should enable you to find your way to at least a diversion airport if necessary. Again, you can't fail the vacuum system in Flight Simulator without the mods, but you can do it with the random failure mod mentioned earlier, so we'll talk more about how to do that at the end of the video. Another failure you can encounter on the 152 that's not an instrument failure is a failed or jammed trim wheel. You can fail this using the random failure mod, or you can simulate this by just not moving the trim wheel. It's pretty straightforward to handle. You just have to maintain control forces that you would normally trim out as you fly the airplane. It's easy to describe, but harder to fly. Maintaining constant pressure, control pressure, can actually be a bit fatiguing. If you want to give it a try, just fly a traffic pattern without touching the trim or with it failed in the third-party mod and see how you do. You'll find out how important that trim wheel actually is. The other big system that can fail on the 152 is the electrical system. Again, we can't fail this in Flight Sim using the fail menu. You either have to use the random failure mod or just turn the electrical switches off, and we'll do the latter for all those Xbox users out there. The way this electrical system failure typically occurs in the 152 in flight is that the alternator fails. The alternator is the component attached to your engine that generates electricity for you and recharges the battery when it's been depleted by something like an engine start. In this picture here, you can see the amp meter depicting that the battery is being charged. It's to the plus side, which means the battery is getting energy right now. In the real aircraft, an alternator failure will cause this red light underneath the amp meter to come on, but this is not currently working in Flight Simulator, at least as of Sim Update 6. The other indication of an alternator failure is the amp meter deflecting towards the left or negative side. This indicates that the battery is being drained rather than being charged. Both of these indications are easy to miss, particularly during the day, and plenty of pilots have missed them. The amp meter is way on the right-hand side of the cockpit, and it's easy to exclude from your instrument scan. Once the alternator fails, the battery is left powering the entire electrical system. The battery in most aircraft will typically last about a half an hour before they run out of juice, and this seems to hold true in Flight Simulator in the 152. If you notice the alternator failure, you can maximize the time the battery will last by turning off any electrical components you don't need, though I haven't verified that this will have any effect in Flight Simulator. Things you can depower individually on the 152 include your lights and pitot heat. It's not a bad idea to keep your beacon on during the day and your nav lights on at night so folks can see you, but you do have to balance that against how long you want your battery to last, because if you're at night and you lose the electrics, that can be quite challenging. You can depower your comm and nav radios. Just be aware that on the 152, the comm navs work as a single unit. In other words, for comm and nav 2, you depower it using this button right here. You just twist it all the way to the left, and that will turn it off. But it will depower both comm and nav 2, so you lose both of those. Same thing holds true for comm and nav 1. And what people will typically do is if they need a comm radio or they need a nav radio, they'll just depower number 2, so they still have number 1, but it does reduce the electrical load somewhat. You can also depower your transponder, turn that to off if you are not communicating with ATC and you're not in an area where you need to use a transponder. And then you can depower the ADF, although I think it's defaults to the off position anyway, so it may already be off, but you just twist this little knob right here all the way to off, and that will turn that off. Once the battery runs out of power, you'll lose anything on the aircraft that is electrically powered. This typically happens one component at a time in aircraft in the real world, with high draw items usually losing power first, but in Flight Sim, everything will depower at the same time. The things that you'll lose once you've lost your electrical system include the turn indicator portion of your turn coordinator, your engine gauges, so your fuel quantity gauges, your oil temp, and your oil pressure gauges, all your interior and exterior lighting, and your pitot heat, both your comm and nav radios, your transponder, your ADF, and the flap motors. You'll be able to move the handle, but the flaps themselves will not move. So you won't, whatever position the flaps are in when your battery stops giving you power is the position that the flaps will remain in for the duration of the flight. Fortunately, the spark for your engine spark plugs comes from two magnetos that operate independently of the electrical system and each other, so the engine will keep running just fine. And the only flight instrument you lose is your turn coordinator. Even your engine tachometer will continue to work. At night, the loss of interior lighting can be an issue. In real life, it's wise to carry a flashlight in case you lose your interior lighting, so you have a way to illuminate the instruments. Fortunately, in Flight Simulator, you always carry a flashlight that is also apparently a headlamp. The default key binding to toggle it on and off is Alt-L, so just hit Alt-L, and that will bring your flashlight on, and then it will track with your camera and point at and illuminate anything that you'd like to look at inside the cabin that's, close enough that you can point the light at and illuminate it, and even outside the cabin apparently. So you can use that if you have lost your electrical system to be able to see your instruments at night. Also be aware that your taxi and landing lights will be in op, so you will have to land without those at night if you've lost your electrical system. So the scenario that we'll set up for today's demo flight is that we'll do a normal takeoff from Pine Bluff like we're heading on a cross-country in day VFR conditions. We'll do the takeoff with flaps 0 since we haven't done one of those before, just to see one of those. It's not very different from a flaps 10 takeoff, but we'll just take a look at that. Once we get airborne and probably around our cruising altitude, we will experience an electrical systems failure, and that will lead us to return to land at Pine Bluff. We'll actually have an alternator failure first and see if we can recognize that. And then once we recognize that, we'll go ahead and progress that to a total electrical systems failure. We'll return to Pine Bluff, and then when we get to Pine Bluff, we're going to have to do a no-flap landing at Pine Bluff. So as far as the procedure goes for a normal takeoff with flaps 0, it's really not going to be that much different than a normal takeoff with flaps 10. The only thing that changes is that instead of retracting our flaps as we're accelerating through 60 knots, we're not going to do that. The rest of the procedure is pretty much identical. We want the before takeoff checklist complete. We'll release the brakes. We'll apply full takeoff power. We'll maintain our runway center line with the rudder pedals. We'll still rotate at 50 knots. It's still going to be about 10 degrees pitch up. We'll maintain the pitch attitude for the initial climb, and probably, a couple hundred feet, we'll start pitching for 70 knots. We'll try to trim to maintain that pitch, and then when we get to 1,000 feet, we'll turn the taxi and landing light off, and we'll accomplish the after takeoff checklist. And it's really not going to feel all that different. Really, between flaps 0 and flaps 10, the takeoff feels very similar in the 152. You're not going to notice that much of a difference. Okay, so to set up for this demo flight, we'll go to the world map and we'll work left to right like we usually do. So we'll go down and we'll select our aircraft. Been playing around with the jets here in the last few days. Textron's Cessna 152 is what we want today. And then we'll go to weight and balance and set it up with a standard load, full tank of fuel, 170-pound occupants. Then we will select our departure airport, KPBF. That'll be runway 18, like we usually use. And then we'll go ahead and set the time down here to about noon. We'll set the date to, again, mid-June for our lighting conditions. And then once we get into the sim, we'll set up the weather. And we are ready to go flying. All right, the last few things we need to do is we'll click on the weather, and we'll go ahead and get rid of that wind layer so we don't have to deal with the crosswind when we're doing our first no-flap landing. And we'll set the temperature up to a more realistic 25 degrees Celsius. And that's all done. We are ready to go flying. All right, so we'll go ahead and do a flap 0 normal takeoff. My before takeoff checklist is complete. Parking brake is released. Flaps are set to 0 for this takeoff, so we are ready to go. So we'll go ahead and apply full takeoff power. And use the rudder to steer your nose wheel. Keep yourself on the center line just like you would with any other takeoff. Airspeed is alive, looking for 50 knots to rotate. There's 50 knots, so go ahead and pitch up 10 degrees. accelerating through 60, but there's no flaps to retract, so I'll just kind of pitch and let it continue to accelerate. Don't have to worry about that nose down tendency, but that actually kind of helped you accelerate to 70, so we'll pitch down just a little bit under 10 degrees to accelerate up to 70 knots here. And then once we've got 70 knots, we'll just pitch to maintain that 70 knots. And coming through 1,000 feet, we'll turn off our taxi and our landing lights and do our after takeoff checklist. Alright, so there is 1,000 feet. Go ahead and turn off the taxi light and the landing light, and I'll perform my after takeoff checklist. And what we're going to do here to set up for our abnormal situation is we're going to take up a heading of about 140 or so, and we're going to climb up to 3,500 feet, just like we're doing a cross-country heading down the Arkansas River here, maybe heading over towards Greenville for our first cross-country flight that we did. And then when we level off at 3,500 feet, we're going to find out that we have had an alternator failure, and we will talk about how to deal with that. All right, so we've leveled off at our cruising altitude of 3,500 feet. We've run our cruise checklist, and we'll go ahead and reach over here to the battery master switch, the alternator side, and turn that off to simulate a alternator failure. And I wouldn't do this for a prolonged period of time in the real aircraft. If you drain the battery significantly, you could run into thermal issues with the battery overheating. It's okay probably to turn it off and see if your student notices, if they've had the failure. But once they've had the failure, you can just simulate the rest of the electrical failure by turning the battery off, so you don't deplete the battery, because that can again cause you thermal issues. So we'll pretend we've leveled off, we've done our cruise checklist. In the process of scanning our cockpit, we notice that we are getting a discharge indication on our amp meter. And again, normally in the real 152, that red light would also come on to indicate that the battery is discharging and not charging, but that doesn't work in flight simulators. So we've got a battery discharging. We know that the alternator has probably failed. We know that we have about 30 minutes or so left before the battery runs out of juice and we have no electrical power anymore. So probably the prudent course of action is to return back to Pine Bluff for a precautionary landing. So we'll go ahead and start that turn and get ourselves headed back to Pine Bluff. We'll just make a 180 turn to heading about 300, and that should point us in the direction of Pine Bluff. All right, so we've turned around. It's actually about a heading of a 315 or 320 to get back to Pine Bluff. I can kind of see the city up here, the bend in the river, and it looks like the field is about right here. So I'm heading in the right directions. I've got a good visual on about where the airport is, so no danger in getting lost heading back that direction. So now I'm going to try to maximize the amount of time that my battery is going to last. So I don't need the pitot heat. I'm not in clouds or anything. No worry of pitot ice forming up. Go ahead and turn the nav lights off because I don't need those during the day. I'll turn the strobe lights off. Those are a high draw item. I'll leave the beacon on so other folks can see me. And then right now I don't need comm or nav number 2, so I'll go ahead and twist that down to off and turn that off. Don't really need the transponder since I'm not in airspace that requires a transponder, and I'm not talking to ATC, so I can turn that off. And then I can go ahead and turn the ADF off as well, and that should help me to conserve battery power and maybe get it to last long enough that I can make a normal landing at Pine Bluff and still have my flaps when I get there. But unfortunately, in these types of scenarios in a training or simulator environment, rarely do things work out like that. As we get a little closer, I can start to see the airport beacon right there, and there is runway 1836 right there. So I'll go ahead and start a descent, and I'll do a normal 45-degree entry into the pattern there at Pine Bluff. But as I start my descent down, I'll go ahead and flip the battery switch off. And unfortunately, we've either been without the alternator for longer than we realized, or it was not a great battery to begin with, and we've lost our electrical system. So we've had a complete electrical system failure. We can tell we've lost our turn coordinator, our fuel quantity gauges have gone to 0, our engine gauges don't work. If we looked outside, we notice that the lights don't work anymore, if we could see them. We notice that our number 1 nav radio has now turned itself off. We turn the ADAF off, and we'll also notice that if we put the flap handle down and we look out the window, oh no, nothing's going to happen. The flaps are not going to move. So we are going to have to do a no flap landing here at Pine Bluff. For now, though, we just need to concentrate on making a normal pattern entry at 1,000 feet AGL, about 1,200 feet here in Pine Bluff. And then let's talk through the procedure for doing a no flap pattern and no flap landing. Okay, so let's look at how a no flap pattern and landing is going to look different from a normal landing. Everything is going to be pretty much the same up until the point where you are abeam the numbers. You want to do your normal pattern entry, fly your normal pattern speeds, and fly a normal pattern altitude of 1,000 feet AGL. It's once you get abeam the numbers that things will change just a little bit. So once you're abeam the numbers, we'll go ahead and pull on that carb heat just like we always do. And then we're going to reduce the power to 1,500 to 1,700 RPMs, which is a little lower than we normally do. In a normal landing where we've got flaps available, we'll usually do about 1,900 RPMs. But we don't have drag to throw out there to slow things down, so we need a little bit lower of a power setting. We'll hold the altitude, we'll hold our pitch, and allow the aircraft to slow to 80 knots. And again, this will probably take a little more time because we don't have drag out we're going to throw out there to slow us down. We're going to pitch to maintain that 80 knots once we get there, and trim is needed to let the aircraft hold that 80 knots. And then we will adjust our power to do a 300 to 400 foot per minute descent. So once we reach the 80 knots, pitch to hold the 80 knots and adjust your power so that you get that descent rate. And you'll find that 1,500 to 1,700 RPMs should do the trick. We are going to also extend the downwind leg for a little bit longer, a final. So we'll go a little bit past that 45-degree point and make a little bit longer of a final so we have a nice long straight-in final to kind of have things all stabilized and make sure that we're on speed. On the base leg, not much is different except we're just not adding the flaps. We want to pitch for 70 knots now, and trim is needed. You may need to bring the power back a little bit to get that 70 knots. And then once you have the 70 knots, adjust the power to maintain that descent rate at 70 knots. So on final, we'll pitch for 65 knots. That will be our final approach speed rather than 60 knots. And there's two reasons for that. The first is that our stall speed is now VS1 versus VSO. VS1 is about 5 knots faster than VSO since we don't have our flaps out. So we'll want to bump that up just a little bit to have a little more margin from our stall speed. And it's also the speed that's recommended for a no flap landing when you have no power, when you do an emergency landing with no flaps. So that's the number that we'll use today. Once you get on 65 knots, just adjust your power to stay on the glide slope, and you should find that 1,500 to 1,700 RPMs should be about right to keep you on the glide slope at 65 knots on final approach. Should give you that 300 to 400 foot per minute descent. And again, do that until you can see the VASI, and once you've got the VASI, just adjust the power to stay on the glide slope. We'll accomplish a modified before landing checklist. Obviously, the flaps will not be down, so we can't check that off the list as we normally do. We'll just modify it for that one item and run the before landing checklist before we land. And then the way the round out and flare works is you want to keep your 65 knots and keep your descent rate going until you're over the numbers. Stay on that glide slope. Once you're over the numbers, go ahead or once you cross the threshold, go ahead and pull the power to idle, pitch for that 65 knots until you get right above the runway. Then do a normal round out, level out to fly level down the runway. And then the flare may be just a little bit slower than what we're used to with flaps. We'll bring the nose up just a little bit slower, but we still want to just try to hold it right off the runway. And then you still want to aim for a normal pitch attitude as you flare. So you still want that 5 to 10 degrees nose up. But you will find that the aircraft will have a tendency to float in the flare. It won't touch down quite as quickly as it did when you had flaps in there, and that is normal. So you're going to be holding the airplane off the runway just a little bit longer than you're used to when you have no flaps, because you don't have that drag out there. The aircraft is quite a bit more efficient, and when you get a ground effect, it's going to tend to want to fly longer. Because of that, we do want to adjust our landing length that we need when we have this condition. Normally for the 152, 1,000 feet is plenty of runway to get it down when you have full flaps and using short field techniques. For zero flap landings, I would at least triple that amount. I would say at least 3,000 feet when you have a no flap situation to get the aircraft down and get it stopped. Once you're on the ground, go ahead and let the nose wheel come to the ground and then just apply normal braking as you would in a normal landing and taxi off the runway once you've reached a safe taxi speed. All right, so I'm established in the downwind here. I'm doing a normal traffic pattern altitude, normal speed, and I'm looking for a beam the numbers. So there's a beam the numbers, so I'm going to go ahead and throw on that carb heat. I'm going to pull the power back to about 1,500 RPMs. It's going to be fairly close to idle throttle. And then I'm just going to hold my altitude, hold that 1,200 feet until I get to about 80 knots. And then once I get to 80 knots, I'll go ahead and let the nose come down, and I'll adjust that power to get about a 300 or 400 foot per minute descent. I'll take a look out to the left here. I'm at about that 45-degree point, but I'm going to hold off just a little bit on that base leg and just extend this pattern a little bit. Make myself just a little bit longer a final. Take one more look back. I think that's probably enough distance here, so I'll go ahead and turn that base leg. So I'm turning the base leg here. I'm going to pitch up just a little bit to try to get that speed slowed down to about 70 knots. And then I'll adjust the power as I need to maintain that 70 knots at about a 300 or 400 foot per minute descent rate. So again, just a little bit different. We need a lot less power than we did in a normal pattern. You can see the 1,500 feet or 1,500 RPMs is working out pretty well. So I've got myself on the base leg here, overshot the turn just a little bit, and coming up on our final here. Take one more look over to the left. Looks like we're good to start rolling out. A little bit slow, but I want that 65 knots on final, so I won't add in too much power. Overshot the runway just a little bit, but we're on glide slope, so that's looking good. You have to be careful though, because you add too much power and it can get fast real quick on you without any flaps. So I'm doing about 75 knots. I'm about 10 knots fast. So I'm going to pull that power back. I'm on the glide slope. That's looking good. I want about a 65 knots for my final speed here. A little high on the glide, so I want to let it come down maybe about 500 feet per minute. Try to get on that final speed of about 65 knots. You can see I'm almost at idle power here. A little high and a little fast. I'm trying to correct. So there's that 65 knots. Aiming point is looking good. As I come over the numbers, I'll go ahead and pull the power to idle. As I get down over the runway, it's a normal round out. And then a little slower to flare because the aircraft is going to want to float. So I'll just gradually bring that nose up and hold it off. Here's about 10 degrees. Touch down. Just a normal landing off of that. Let the nose wheel come down to the ground. Looks like I can make that next taxiway just fine. I'll go ahead and apply normal braking. And then once I'm down to a safe taxi speed, I'll go ahead and turn off the runway and see if I can find a mechanic and see if maybe they can get me a new alternator. So that is a zero flap landing in the 152. Again, it's not really that big of a deal in a small aircraft like this. Speed is not much different. It's just going to feel a little bit different, a little slower on the flare. It's going to require much less power to fly the pattern, and then you just have to be aware of that tendency to float once you get over the runway. So let's take a look at the third-party app that you can use to induce failures on yourself. The title of the app is RAND Failures FS 2020. You can find a link for it at flightsim.to, but you do have to be very specific what you search for to be able to find the hub, and then it just gives you a link to the GitHub link, which is where you need to download it. So the most direct place to go is to the GitHub link for it, which is github.com/Canaran/RAND failures FS 2020. The R and the F in RAND failures is capitalized as the FS, and I'll put a link to this in the video description below. Like most, this is a freeware app, and like most freeware people out there that put out apps, they do ask for donations to support development of the app. And I do encourage that if you like and enjoy the apps that people put out there for people to use for free, at least consider giving them a contribution to help them in their development efforts. You can scroll down, it has a description of how the thing works, and we'll talk more about that here in just a little bit. And then you go down here and it has the download link, so click on that, and then just click on RAND Failures FS 2020 version 1.8.zip, and that will download it to your download file or to your download folder. Then just go in and extract that, and you can just extract it to any folder. It will be able to hook up from or to Flight Simulator from any folder that you put it into. It does not need to be put in the community folder to be able to work correctly. It will be able to hook up with Flight Sim 2020 from any folder you put it into. So let's take a look at how to connect it up to Flight Simulator and how to make things happen with it. Also, I'll mention that it says it hasn't been tested with Flight Sim Update 6. It was actually released before Sim Update 5, possibly even 4, but I have run it with, I believe, with Sim Update 6, and it is working fine. All right, so once I have the app the mod downloaded and unzipped into its own folder, I'm looking for the RAND Failures FS 2020 application. We'll start the mod up, and again, this doesn't have to be in the community folder. It will work on its own from wherever you put it. So I'll just double click on that to get the app running, and now the app is up and running. All right, so once we're actually in the app itself, we have several tabs at the top up here. The Options tab gives you the option to decide where the failure is going to occur. So we're going to talk about more about that here in just a little bit. We have 3 different tabs where we can select what type of failure we want to occur. We've got the System tab. This lets you fail things like left flap, right flap, elevator trim, rudder trim and aileron trim. We don't have this in the 152, so if you set a failure here, that's not going to do anything. It does have primary flight control failures where you can fail your elevator, fail your rudder, fail your aileron. These are beta tests right now, so they're not guaranteed to work correctly, but you can try them out and see how they work for you. You can set yourself up to get a fuel leak where the fuel will drain out of your tank. It's got right and left tank. The center tank, again, won't work because we don't have it in the 152. And pretty much anything that you don't have in an aircraft that you're flying, if you set a failure there, it's not going to do anything. You can also give yourself a brake failure. You can fail both brakes or just the left or right brake. The gear failures are the gear failing to extend on retractable gear aircraft, so that's not going to do anything for us, but you could fail left, right, or nose wheel on that one. And then you've got a tab over here to select what the failure possibilities are for any of those failures there. On the engines, it has up to 4 engines that you can fail. Only engine 1 will work on the 152. We don't have a liquid-cooled engine, so the coolant link won't do anything. Turbocharger won't do anything. You can set to where you're going to have an engine fire. All this does is it makes for a slow reduction in power, and I assume that's what the Flight Simulator engine fire does as well. But you can also set yourself up to have just a regular old engine failure where the engine quits running. The panel failures is where you get your instrument failures, so you can fail your airspeed indicator, your altimeter, your attitude indicator, your compass, which would be an interesting failure, your electrical system, your vacuum system, I guess your engine again, you could do that on that page as well, or your pitot tube, your heading indicator, or your vertical speed indicator. You can also fail the vacuum system, the full electrical system. You can simulate a pitot tube blockage or a static port blockage, and you can also do a hydraulic failure, which I assume on the 152 would probably take away your brakes since that's the only hydraulic system on the 152. But this may be referring to a hydraulic pump failure and not, and since we don't have a hydraulic pump, it may not do anything at all. You also have a failure list so that once you connect on up to Flight Sim and you click the start button and start getting failures, you can go here and see what has failed if you're having trouble identifying it. It also has a little README on how to use and then help menu here that tells you more about how to use the things in here. But basically, you put a percentage chance that something is going to fail. You can do anything from 0, meaning it will not fail, to 100%, meaning it will for sure fail in there. And then, anything that you select to fail will have that chance of having a failure. In the options menu is how you go in and set up how things are triggered. You can trigger things to fail at altitudes. You can trigger them to fail in times. This is done in seconds. So if you want to do it in, say, 5 minutes, you'd have to take the 5 minutes and multiply it by 60 seconds to get what the time value that you want. You can also set it to fail at a certain speed or range of speeds. You can also limit the number of failures. So if you want kind of a random failure of a component, but you want to be surprised by what it is, you can go into the system pages and select everything to 100%, but then limit the number of failures to 1. And that will give you, 100% chance that something will fail, but you won't know what it is until it happens. And then down here is how you set which parameters it uses to determine when the failure happens. Instant means it's pretty much as soon as you connect Flight Simulator and click start, the failure will occur. Random altitude means if you select this, it will fail in between the two altitudes that you set here. So for instance, if I wanted to set the failure to happen at 3,500 feet, cruise altitude on a VFR flight, I just put 3,500 in for the min altitude failure. I put 35 in for the max altitude failure, and then I put fail at a random altitude, and that's when it's going to happen. Same thing with the time. I can do that and select after a random time or the speed, and I can select that. That's a real good way to give yourself a V1 cut in a large jet where you get an engine failure right at V1 is to put your V1 speed in the min failure speed, put it in both the min and the max failure, and then click at random speed, and then give yourself 100% chance of whichever engine or both engines, and limit your failures to 1 if you don't want to know which engine it is that's going to fail on you. And so that's a way you can give yourself a V1 cut. So a specific example of how you could fail something, let's say that I want to give myself a vacuum system failure and I want to do it at my cruise altitude of 3,500 feet. I will set it up to vacuum failure percent chance of 100%. Then I'll go to options and I will set the altitude to 3,500 feet for the minimum. And this is in MSL. 3,500 feet for the maximum, and then I will choose that it will fail at a random altitude, and then I will list the number of failures to 1 because I don't want anything else to fail on me. And then once I've got Flight Simulator booted up, I clicked connect, and then I clicked start, and that will engage the failures, and then once I hit 3,500 feet, it should trigger the failure. All right, so let's take a look real quick at a quick example of how to fail something using this in flight. So I've got the random failure pulled up right now, so it is active. I'll click connect to connect it to Flight Simulator, and it will say that SimConnect is connected. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this as an instant failure, and I'm going to go to systems. I'm going to give myself, let's see here, we'll actually do panel. I'm going to give myself a vacuum failure, so I've got that set to 100%. So I'm going to fail the vacuum system failures. So now if I just click on start after having done that, then it will go ahead and fail my vacuum system. So click on start, you can see the suction drops off, the flags pop up on the attitude indicator and the heading indicator. My vacuum system has failed. So that's how you can do an instant failure there. So I'll go over to the failure list and it will show, or I'll click show fail list and it will say toggle vacuum failure. To clear that out, all I need to do is clear the list, and then I will go back to options and I will click stop, and then I will click start again, and that brings the vacuum system back to life again. And then I can just repeat that process for anything that I want to fail, but again, you can do it at an altitude, at takeoff, at a time, at a speed, any of those parameters you want to set in there. So that's a demonstration of how this system works to fail systems and instruments if you want to do that. So that concludes this lesson. Hopefully this has given you the skills you need to deal with any abnormal situations you choose to take on in the course of your flying. In the next lesson, we'll explore how to deal with emergency situations. As always, if you've enjoyed the content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.